I want to extend greetings to the audience, many of you who are personal friends of mine, schoolmates, classmates, and critics. I understand we are to compare the system as it was before integration and after integration. As I look back upon the years, and many people will criticize me for this, but I thought as far as the blacks were concerned, we had a terrific system here in Washington. The only thing we lacked was adequate supplies, paraphernalia like movie screens, an 8-inch movie screen in the junior high school, imagine that, and the failure to deliver supplies to us when they were due and when they were requisitioned. By that I mean, for example, a piano designated for our schools finally winds up, after being delivered to the white schools, a second-hand piano. A brand new high school opened up in the Northeast, Spingarn I think it was, and not the first book. These were the things that integration worked an advantage to us. But as far as our schooling was concerned, it seems that before integration, our teachers had more interest and were motivating the students more so than it happened later on. Because by the influx of organizations, teachers worrying about their salaries, and had a right to do that too, but not worry about them, and other matters, the student began to get lost in the background. There's one particular thing that strikes me, and I think you should be aware of it because it is a fact, that before integration there was no question of discipline in the then called colored schools. Discipline was rigid. Now I remember talking to someone the other day and they said, on the line, they said, well, that puts you in mind of the schools when I attended them before integration. But after integration, we got all free, we wanted to do our thing and not what one would expect us to do under the old system. Under the old system, we had outstanding teachers, no question about it. I'm sort of an adopted Dunbar alumnus because many people who knew me during the time that I was on the board, and I got on the board back in '51, if you remember, when they tried to shove off on us a elementary school as a replacement for a high school because the high school was overcrowded. And that is the main factor that impelled us to protest, and some other words I like to use, but it would be not good for polite company. But it wasn't a question of the quality of the education. Now, some people don't like to hear me say it, but that's absolutely true. For example, we have more Phi Beta Kappas at Dunbar High School teaching high school than they had in many colleges. And where did our graduates go? They went to all the prestigious universities in the country before integration. So we stood to gain nothing on that score. But what we did gain was the fact of being recognized as a person and not as another element in the community. For example, Eastern High School sent track teams in the pen relays who ran against Dunbar and the other high schools in the city. And yet, within this District of Columbia here, Eastern High School was not permitted to compete with Dunbar or any other high school in the city if they were not white. So these are the things that cause us to feel that integration was demanded and it was necessary, because then you cannot exclude us, you must include us, and you cannot shove off on us things that no one else wants. I can truthfully say I felt that the times that I spent on the board were very fruitful, and it's most interesting that some of the things you're bringing up now, for example, the academic high school, The academic high school was recommended by our board back in 1952. And now this Board of Education, as it now sits, and some of the same persons on there were criticizing us back there then. Now they voted for the academic high school. Just think of it. So, as I say, as far as I'm concerned, the difference that presents itself is not one of quality, but it's one of acceptance. It's one of knowing one another. It's one of respect. So I will not consume any more time on this. I think Brother Langhorne, incidentally, I always remember Sir Langhorne because back in 1960, I think it was 61,
Yeah.
if you remember, there was a book, I think it was Salinger, wasn't it?
Catching the Rye.
Catching the Rye. And they were going to fire him for teaching the kids, having them read Catching the Rye. Could you imagine that? And Catching the Rye was a book read by all the outstanding secondary schools, not only public but private. And yet they're going to fire him for letting the kids read Catching the Rye. But I can boastfully say that
You saved me.
I saved you. Okay, so you can carry on from that point.
Okay. I hardly know what to say. I'm able to find a moderator of this panel, supposedly the one who was to help us, and I talked with Betty Perry, who's been busy with all phases of this program, and she said, just say something about the values of your schooling at Dunbar High School. Well, many things that can be said, and one essential thing I learned at Dunbar High School was the endeavor to trust in my own powers. And I think that was true of many of my fellow students during the 20s. We tried to have the belief that we could succeed in a world that was somewhat hurly-burly. I remember as a freshman hearing our principal, Dr. Gardner Wilkinson, who later became superintendent of the Negro schools, tell of the story of a man named Ed Gray. Ed Gray was a star football player at Amherst College well, he finished M Street about 1914, so it must have been just before the World, or during World War I. But anyway, Gray tackled a white opponent in a football game while he was representing Amherst. The white opponent became enraged and called Gray a black ape. Gray withheld the blow, and after the game, his opponent came to him with his head bowed and said he was ashamed of himself. He said he'd lost control of himself because a Negro player had outwitted him and outplayed him. Many times our principals and our teachers taught us, often indirectly, how to deal with slights and exclusions. As we sought equality in American citizenship. Another instance I remember at the time of my graduation, a former Dunbar valedictorian who was a scholastic leader at his college, Eastern small college, was denied a position on the faculty after graduation simply because of the fact that he was of Negro origin. His ability was unquestioned, and 25 years later he was given a position as distinguished service professor at one of America's eminent universities. Yes, Dunbar, I know during my day in the 20s, was a unique period in American educational history when a Negro school, as I said in the magazine review I wrote about Mrs. Mary Hunley's book on Dunbar, that with the stimulus of high-quality teaching and strong curriculum, with the support of dedicated and sensible teachers, parents rather, good facilities and qualified pupils, all these were combined to produce a landmark in which excellent academic performance was cherished. Now, the fine records made by the graduates of this school reinforce the rightness of this position. When I graduated in the middle 20s at Dunbar, the commencement speaker was Attorney Charles H. Houston, who was known in later years as the father of civil rights legislation. He was only 30 years old. He had just come back to his native city at the age of 30 after returning to the United States from a period of foreign study. He was given this fellowship as a reward for graduating from Harvard Law School with high honors. On the same program, Superintendent Wilkinson read aloud the records of Dunbar graduates who were leading their classes at the best white and Negro colleges. So the message of aspiration was loud and clear from every angle. From my graduation class of 200 people, 16 of us went on to integrated colleges in the East and West to test our fortunes. Practically all of the 16 graduated on time. The Dunbar faculty wanted us to share the cultural values of the general American society, not merely to be successful in the Negro community. They wanted us to be judged by universal standards of accomplishment. Now here's a black school that dared to produce products that were equal in worth when compared to those of the best high schools in the country. The psychologist Kenneth Clark once wrote, "This was an atypical and atypical phenomenon in which all the variables came together in a particular time and place. And this phenomenon was not likely to happen again. But on the other hand, a good many blacks and whites have not been impressed by this painful dilemma. Some blacks have said, 'Do these Negroes wish to be white?' And some whites have said, 'Were they really equal?' And what about the influence," some whites said, "of their white and their Indian ancestors?" You know, that question was first raised by Harry Beecher Stowe many years ago. These people of that persuasion forget that in every race there are certain people endowed with superior mental qualities. Never mind the indifference of these unbelievers. So to counteract the ambivalent position of the persons mentioned above, let us go back and remember the background of the Negro schools in Washington during the 1870s and the 1880s when they were getting underway. At that time, there were a good many free Negroes concentrated here who had the rudiments of a primary education. I still have my great-grandfather's description of his children in clear Spencerian handwriting, written before he migrated to Washington from Virginia in 1880. So there's some Negroes who could, well, at that time, free schools had been clearly established here, and they were serving the needs of a good many ambitious people. My mother came here in 1902 after finishing Manassas Institute, because this was the best place for educating her children if she happened to marry young, as many of her friends had done, and have children. Now, progress in jobs, in political rights, in public accommodations were slow at that time in Washington, and they were painful. But the environment for progress was a little more favorable here in the nation's capital than it was in other southern states. That's why a lot of blacks came here. Now, the black school, the black church, the black lodge were the three places which would somewhat compensate for discrimination in public affairs and in school matters. Besides, there were the open cultural institutions, the museums, the libraries, government buildings, Howard University. All these aided in the advancement of the colored people in the nation's capital during Reconstruction. Dunbar fought against externally imposed segregation and self-imposed separatism. But if this was the way it was to be, the Negro citizens determined that we could create here a monument of surpassing success despite the odds against us. Unlike some of the situations we see today, the achievers of the 20s were looked up to as models we wanted to emulate. Many D.C. students nowadays, in contrast to the past, seem to have lost hope, and certain school board members of today help them to be engulfed by their own weakness. The upward reach was still at Dunbar when I came back to teach there in 1947 after a 22-year period of wandering around America, studying, teaching, and what have you. I soon found out in the evening of 1947 that the Dunbar staff of 80 was still composed of products of the best black and white colleges in America, and 6 of the 80 were Phi Beta Kappas. This desire to achieve was still at that old red brick building over 30 years ago. Now it's replaced. What has happened to all of it? I've been asked, and I asked questions of the coordinator, to say something about my own experiences at Dunbar High School. Who can forget, as May Miller mentioned, Cap Neville Thomas, local president of the NAACP, who lifted our sights for equality as he recounted a number of clever manipulations for dealing with discriminatory occurrences. And there was Haley Douglas, grandson of Frederick Douglass, who regaled us with his exploits and told us how he was judged at the Harvard entrance examinations by the quality of his work and the thoroughness of his entrance examination rather than the length of his responses. I never forgot that lesson. He said he took a piece of an engine and drew all the parts of it. This is the physics entrance examination at Harvard. He didn't know some of the answers to the questions, but he did so thoroughly the diagram of this engine that they passed him in the Harvard physics entrance examination. And we remember the gleam in the eye when Mary Burrell recited the Three Wise Men. She sponsored our school plays and speech contests. And I'll always remember Miss Europe at the piano as we sang with pride the Negro spirituals for such honored guests as James Weldon Johnson and Harry T. Burley. I can still visualize that red and black school banner hanging from the rafters, the black for racial identity, the red for our courage. Keep a plugging away was our motto. It was taken from the poetry of the man who our school was named for, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Keep a plugging away. That applied to many things. And there was the guidance of our beloved principal, Walter L. Smith, who can forget him, who presided over the school in the period of its greatest development, 21 years. I went into the cadet corps, and his assistant. Cadets was something then in those days, and I thought there was something. And he told me that the cadets had long-time badges. I couldn't see it then. So anyway, I ended up as captain of Company A, as Rayford Logan is mentioned here, captain of Company A, commanding that was the highest line officer position, a position which many men who became prominent once occupied. I thought I was Napoleon. I'd put my hand in my vest like it was short, you know, and stocky like the ponies. I'd walk around. But I found my privates in my company were calling me something else. They used to call me Nappy Leon. My name is Leon Langhorne, Nappy Leon. I won't forget that. Well, the military served me well when I joined the Navy later. And when I was in college, a Michigan congressman offered me an interview for a chance at West Point. But I knew my efforts in the 20s would be futile, so I didn't take him up on that. I didn't want to go to West Point anyway. I wouldn't have probably got in at that time. And there were other values. Miss Brooks, the assistant principal, you all remember, decreed that the girls were to be called Miss by their teachers. And this brought forth the realization that they were to conduct themselves as real ladies. And there were the featured dances in the armory and the Christmas post office with its romantic attachment. Some of my closest friends are people I went to school with in Dunbar now. I even married one of them, a girl I used to date, here today. And there were lessons to be learned from the beautiful spring festival, sponsored by the gracious Jim Cowan. And the spring festival, the grand finale, was always a mock marriage of a fine young man, a fine young woman. Many girl in that audience clapped as she dreamed about her own big marriage day when she, too, would walk in radiance down the aisle, and many cheered her. We were happy in our adolescence, but that was a lesson we learned just from that festival of someday you want to look forward to marrying and have a family. We were happy in our adolescence as we dreamed of our families and the children we were to rear just as we were reared. In my travels around the country, I've often been asked if my life was enriched by having attended Dunbar. You know, I attended a lot of schools, taught a lot of places, finally came back home. What is it? A wandering stone catches, the rolling stone gets no more. But anyway, I may have denied some of the privileges and received some slights if I had gone to an integrated high school during that time. But when I was a sophomore at Michigan, a white student from Washington asked me if I didn't mind that I was not white. I said, hell no. Why should I? My family, my schooling, and my religion had given me a sense of security and accomplishment. Self-esteem would guide me in confronting these obstacles. I was the first Negro to receive a sweater for tennis at Michigan. It was a hard struggle, but I still have the sweater. I still kept on it as a result of it. The question's been asked me too. I talked to Betty about this. What did you learn from this school experience? Was it a key to a better life? Yes. This training enabled me to take advantages of many cultural opportunities that my father never experienced in his youth in segregated Lynchburg, where Negro education stopped at the end of the 8th grade. Till I went down there a few years ago, I always thought Lynchburg was named in honor of the Negroes they lynched down there. But I found out it wasn't. It was a public official named Lynch. That's who it was named of. My father never discussed that, but he was glad to get out of there. The exemplary careers of Dunbar graduates for 3 generations gave me tenacity to go on in higher education. And these days of the pot, the pill, the tube, and the street kind, ambitious careers have been lost sight of in many of the young. And jobless youth, you see them standing on the corner, smoking, fire on one, Mr. Smith used to say, fire on one end, fool on the other. Every time he spits, he thinks he cracks a brick. On the other hand, many are preparing themselves for careers which were unheard of in various parts of the United States. I've tried to uplift the students under my charge, which I taught. And remembering the encouragement of my own teachers, I never wanted a student to leave my office with a feeling of envy in his heart. I'm still contributing in various ways to the present students at Dunbar High School with the aim of supporting their aspirations. We who think we have it made, should lend our hands to others and bring them up. Time's up. All right, I've got one more paragraph. The Dunbar of the 20s was not all things to all people. Athletics were then kept in perspective. The students were mainly from struggling families of modest means, and they represented a cross-section of Negro people in appearance and family income. Many were interested in professions, although their parents were not professionals. Why should we not now have an academic high school for those interested in achievement and advancing the concerns of our people, or people in general? We need the best trained minds to interpret the thinking of the masses, to do something about their needs. The head in the sand people can't help very much. We must educate towards American standards and not ignore or blur them. And these efforts will increase our progress. I'm glad the story that the old Dunbar High School is being told and recorded by those who witnessed it, so that others may remember it and profit therefrom.
Go ahead. Ms. West.
Recollections from the 1920s and 30s. As I look back, I realize that my parents and their peers had a plan, a philosophy for our survival. To survive, we needed a positive approach. The spirit had to be nourished. We had to have self-confidence and no sense of inferiority. As a result, I felt inferior in no way to my white contemporaries. Coming to Washington in the 5th grade from an integrated system, as did some of my friends, I know that I measured up mentally. In Washington, I met and made many friends who also had no feelings of inferiority. Our role models were definite and firmly established. Our outstanding leaders like Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and Du Bois, our parents, our teachers, our school administrators, our ministers, Board of Education members who had traditionally been with the board since 1885, when my grandfather, James Monroe Gregory, was a member of the Integrated Board, and through the years, John Francis, Molly Church Terrell, Carl E. Franklin Cook, Reverend F.I.A. Bennett, Dr. Hayden Johnson, and more lately, Attorney Wesley Williams. At Dunbar, Armstrong, and Cardozo, we had teachers who had graduated from Oberlin, Radcliffe, Harvard, Amherst, Dartmouth, Howard, Columbia University, Western Reserve, and Wellesley. American culture was in good hands. There was a brotherhood and a sisterhood of the mind that stretched from city to city: Atlanta, Hampton, Richmond, Norfolk, Charleston, Washington, Baltimore, New York City, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Nashville, to name some. College-trained men and women came and went in these cities, knew each other, felt a camaraderie of spirit. They encouraged the young ones coming up with a deep and warm concern. This link, extending to all centers to which the literati migrated, was an implicit bond. Explicitly, fraternities and sororities were established. Norma Boyd, Elsie Smith, Eliza Shippen, Robert Ogle, Nathaniel Murray, H.A. Callis, Herbert Marshall, Eugene Davidson were deeply involved. Also, the Boulay came into being. Aside from the formal training we received in the graded schools and the high schools, Armstrong, Cardozo, and Dunbar, there were outstanding people in the community who spoke to us. Writers like Alain Locke, Rayford Logan, Carter Woodson, James Weldon Johnson. Ministers the Reverends Bullock, Rivers, Holloman, Grimke, Gregory, Emery Smith, Sterling Brown Sr., F.I.A. Bennett. Ladies, Julia West Hamilton, Dean Lucy Slowe. Aside from the messages they brought, they were also role models. We started with the very young. Dorothy Waring Howard had a nursery school, the famous Garden of Flowers. Music lessons were a must. Some of the teachers were Mrs. Rivers, wife of the Reverend, Professor Tibbs, and other members of the Howard University School of Music. Also teachers at the Washington Conservatory of Music, founded by Ida Gibbs Hunt, a graduate of Oberlin. We knew Paul Robeson, Roland Hayes, Coleridge Taylor, Harry T. Burley, Nathaniel Dett, and later Marian Anderson, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Fletcher Henderson, and Cab Calloway. Music recitals were held throughout the city, at Howard University, in churches, in school auditoriums, at which some of the time the Howard University Glee Club or singers from Fisk, Tuskegee, and Hampton would sing. Yearly cultural programs were held in the schools. One such was presented each year by Mary Dulaney Evans. The Minor Normal School presented a yearly pageant under the direction of my father, James Francis Gregory, who was an avid Shakespearean fan. At Amherst, he had played the lead in the class play, Hamlet, and I remember him quoting Shakespeare all his life. If I speak personally, it is because I know these things firsthand. I do realize that throughout the Washington community, similar experiences by other citizens of color were duplicated many times. In our community, parents took part in social activities. There was a mandolin club with members Dr. Albert Ridgely, Mrs. Eula Gray, Mrs. Hawkins, Mr. Benny Washington, a book lovers club, a musolit club. These were indications of parents' interest in aesthetic and spiritual activities, and these produced a like interest in the family. Many families sang in their homes. The Drew family did, led by the father. I know that this philosophy of our parents and their peers did provide us with a spiritual means of survival. Our accumulation of material things was a secondary consideration. Art played an important part in our life. We took lessons from Luther Sadgwar. The faculty of the Howard University art department was brilliant. James Porter, Lois Jones, Lassane Wells, Professor Herring. In the public school system, there were Delilah Pierce, Elizabeth Catlett, Alma Thomas. Showings were held at the Barnett Aiden Art Gallery as well as at Howard. Beautiful embroidery was done by women in sewing clubs. Literature was an important source of inspiration. We read Charles Chestnut, Alexander Dumas Père et Fils, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Phyllis Wheatley, Alexander Pushkin, Langston Hughes, Jean Toomer, Sterling Brown, James Weldon Johnson, May Miller, Georgia Douglas Johnson, Carrie Clifford. In the business world, we admired Wormley, who was an associate of the cream of Washington white society, Roebuck, the Negro partner of Sears and Roebuck, pharmacists McGuire, Howley, and Harriet, undertakers McGuire, Jarvis, and James. In the field of drama, there were the Howard players under Montgomery Gregory, Negro art players known as Arden under Joseph Hill, Lincoln Temple players under Isidore Miles, and we had a native playwright, Angelina Grimke. In education, there were dedicated persons with ability and integrity, such as Garnet Wilkinson, Edward Williams, Roscoe Bruce, Eugene Clark, J. Francis Gregory, Otelia Cromwell, Sadie Daniels, Julia Brooks, G. David Houston, Dr. Anna Cooper. Other important names in the field of education are Syphax, Payne, Cornish, Raymond, Cook. We read and were proud of our newspapers, the Washington Bee, the Philadelphia Tribune, the Afro-American, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News, the Norfolk Journal and Guide were all successfully run with excellent writers. Our churches were a source of moral and spiritual support. Without them, we would have been like ships without a rudder. One of the founders of Berean Baptist Church was a Wormley. Social workers at the YWCA included Mrs. Betty Francis, Mrs. Julia West Hamilton, and later a young Lillian Washington and a young Dorothy Height, and at Southwest Settlement House, a young Georgiana Hare. My reaction to segregation. At the time, I wasn't embittered because my circumscribed and protected life was good, but I was bewildered as I grew older and learned of the hate emanating from some whites. I asked myself, why hate? Is it jealousy because we have achieved despite obstacles? Is it insecurity or uncertainty of worth or of superiority unless there is a lesser people to look down upon? I couldn't figure it out. The only time this hate seemed to spill over was during the race riots back around 1919. A gang started marching up 7th Street from southwest, aiming for Leroy Park. They claimed they wanted to get the dicties. Colored Baltimore heard about the march and sent a truckload of ammunition and guns over post-haste to protect the park. We did not know the people. They just knew we needed help. They said, take what fits. Then they stationed themselves on the roofs of the buildings. Brothers indeed. Meanwhile, President Herbert Hoover called out the cavalry and stopped the marchers at the Howard Theater. The next day, our people held a meeting at the Howard Theater. James Weldon Johnson, president of the NAACP, was among those on the platform. We were really no different from the average American college-educated citizen, same background of learning, with the plus of the lovely spirituals and jazz. If we speak of our Washington people as being middle class, it is with the proviso that there was always upward mobility through the training of the mind. This was encouraged by all parts of the community, churches, organizations like the Urban League, the NAACP, newspapers, magazines, fraternities, sororities, clubs, all sponsored go-to-college contests. Epilogue. If ours was a secret city, it was a live and vital one, vibrant, productive, forward-looking, and forming a base from which our present middle-class majority, the backbone of America, has sprung. It was secret only to one segment of Washington. These are some of the city's distinguished alumni. They exemplify this quotation from Sterling Brown. The strong men and the strong women keep a-comin' on. Robert Weaver, Allison Davis, John Davis, Lorraine Williams, Francis Gregory, William Hasty, Charles Drew, Edward Brooke, Mercer Cook, Sterling Brown, Montague Cobb, Rayford Logan, May Miller Sullivan, Paul Cook, Norman Nickens, Benjamin Henley, Peter Ridley, Bonetta Bullock Washington, Hubert Pear, Marjorie Holloman Parker, Barrington Parker, Burke Syphax, Howard Fitzhugh, Stanton Wormley, Charles Wesley, and in the next generation, Frederick Drew Gregory, Sylvia Drew Ivy, Charlene Drew Jarvis, Otis Holloman Troop, Mary Williamson McHenry, and the latest one that I've heard of is the young Clifford young man, he's not a boy anymore, who has been honored by the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania. And I thought perhaps you might like me to read a poem by his grandmother, Carrie Williams Clifford, which may have sort of looked forward to this honor that came to him. It's called Tomorrow. If I can find it, let's see what page it's on. 24. Tomorrow, magic word of promise rare, what witchery inheres in thy sweet name, inspiring wild ambition naught can tame, to conquer failure, here or otherwhere. The rosy rapture thou dost ever bear upon thy brow is but the beacon flame, the luminous lodestone luring on to fame and high endeavor. Simple friend, beware. The fool who says tomorrow never comes, for opportunities like bursting bombs shall blast the walls that limit us today, and all who wish within its scope to stay. Time has no end save in eternity, of which tomorrow is the prophecy. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. Very good. Dr. Chinn?
Thank you. Following this list, or this group of panelists, I wonder what I might say that hasn't already been said. As I look out here into the audience and see former classmates, former teachers, fellow teachers at Howard, I'm reminded of the fact that all of us somehow manage a homecoming. That the magnet of Dunbar, the public schools, have special meanings for all of us. I look out the audience, I see Miss Elsie Brown Smith, who initiated me into the rigors of English during my freshman year at Dunbar. And I've heard mention of some other teachers tonight, or rather this afternoon, by other panelists. But before I start talking about my impressions of segregated education, divisions 10 through 13, I think that I might say something about my own background first, and then fit what I have to say into that framework. I was born in New England, Connecticut. The first 4 years of my life were spent in a New England school. In that school there were 500 children. The 3 members of my family were the only Negroes. In those first 4 years of that education, I had a chance to see white teachers teaching classes, the majority of whom were first-generation immigrants. There were very few white native children. And of course, the 3 Negro children, incidentally, there weren't more than about 25 children, Negroes in the whole town. The thing that impressed me mostly about that group of teachers was the fact that they were concerned with one thing: trying to reach this foreign immigrant population. And so I was Americanized ad nauseum. English was taught as a second language, and so I got such an overexposure to the fundamentals of English that I finally decided to major in it because it was so easy. Hence my choice of a vocation. But in that early period, I noted that the teachers identified me with the natives, and the others were categorized as those others. I was a first-class citizen. These others were second-class citizens. Italians, Poles, Slecks, call them what you will, all from Europe, Italy. And the teachers made that distinction, which I felt, even as a child. But there was something else that I didn't feel. Although they were disciplining me, and along with the other students, they made me get my work